When I see what China is doing, I'll give you a little China story also. China, I said the other day, very, very hard to buy anything outside of China. Oh, certain other countries also, but China's, the one. And somebody said, well, what would you do? What can you do? So easy. Drop a 25% tax on China. And I said to somebody that it's really the messenger. The messenger is important. I could have one man say, we're going to tax you 25%. And I could say another, listen, you motherfuckers, we're going to tax you 25%. Now, you've said the same exact thing. You've said the same exact thing, but it's a different messenger.
Milan ou Tripoli, Vilnius ou Benghazi, Paris, Moscou, on fait le bunga, bunga. Bangkok ou Bogota, Le Caire ou Jakarta, Gustavia, on fait le bunga, bunga. Stockholm ou Monaco, ou Montevideo, Oslo, Tokyo, on fait le bunga, bunga.
All right, that was Trump in 2011 speaking in Las Vegas, and this right now is Alex Hochuli in 2025 in Sao Paulo, Brazil, joined by BungaCast contributing editor Lee Jones in London. And this is BungaCast, the global politics podcast at the end of history. Very much so every day, more so than the last, very much in the end of history. Hello, Lee.
Hi. Yes, how are you doing in the end of history? Now it's really arrived in force.
Yeah, no, it's good. And I'm living in a country which is kind of going, well, we got off lightly there. Brazil is looking forward to new opportunities. Didn't get hit by the Trump tariffs in the way that many other countries did, or, not to the same extent. Just got hit with the standard 10%. And it's looking at new opportunities. So Latin America as a whole probably for once is going, oh, we kind of got off lightly there.
Yeah, the UK also only got 10% because we run a trade deficit with the United States, but we still got 10%. So that's the special relationship for you. But obviously the mood here is one of panic, effectively, because, of course, Europe is exposed to the security threats of the United States, pulling the rug from under Ukraine, questioning the commitment to NATO, considering some kind of pay-per-use American hegemony as revealed on the Yemen group chat, where things like defending the freedom of navigation globally could somehow be invoiced to Europe. So, Europe's still reeling from the shocks to the US security guarantee and the kind of unraveling of that. And then the trade stuff comes on top of it. And, it's producing extreme discombobulation, as well it should.
Yeah. Extreme discombobulation. Yeah, no, this is, I think, the general feeling around the world in response to Trump's tariffs, even if they were expected to a certain extent. I mean, the Liberation Day announcement on the 2nd of April, I like that he had to wait till the 2nd of April just so people didn't go, wait, is that a joke? Is that an April Fool's? Right? I mean, that's it, the announcements are so shocking and surprising that there would be a risk of people going, is this some sort of joke? It's not an elaborate joke, but we also don't know what the purpose of it is, of the tariffs are, what Trump's thinking is, what the strategy is, and to what extent there is very much long-term strategy to it as well. So all these questions are things we are going to work through. I should say that next week we're having Corey Robin on to discuss more the domestic side of Trump and MAGA, and looking forward to doing that. We thought we would have a discussion, Lee and I, just the two of us, about the tariffs. I should make the proviso that all this is quite provisional, just because we don't know how it's going to play out. But we do feel like we need to kind of at least give it a first shot. And we will, of course, be returning to this in over the course of the next months, years, decades, perhaps. Although, as you told me, Lee, when I said I hadn't followed the news the past couple of days because I had too much work, that the decades were happening in the space of weeks, which is a quote that's been wheeled out. I think, as we note in our book, even it was a quote that started to be wheeled out in 2016 as history suddenly started to accelerate. Although it wasn't Lenin who said it. It's kind of misattributed. I chased this up the other day. Do you know who said it?
I'm not sure actually. I always thought it was Lenin. Yeah.
Right, but it's not. And I looked it up. Oh, I'll owe listeners this another time because I've I've set
No,
myself
you
up to
can't
be like,
dangle
did
that
you
and then
know?
tease us.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, no, but I read a thing where they chased it down, and it's like
No, I read it was
Trotsky
fake
said something
news.
similar. Yeah, but I think it was
Yeah.
something like Trotsky said something similar, and then it
Mhm.
ended up being attributed to Lenin. So anyway, maybe I'll put this in the show notes if I find it in time. So anyway, back to the matter at hand, which is much more important than quotes attributed correctly or not. I just wanted to maybe start with this point about, in terms of kind of setting up Trump's perspective on this, POV, as the kids say, which is Trump's experience with Japan in the 1980s. And we were just talking off air about how there's a lot that is quite 1980s about this, but also ways which very much depart in terms of the global historical scenario from the 1980s. So you can't really make that comparison. But nevertheless, Trump is the most revolutionary president since Ronald Reagan thus far, and could well exceed that even. It's interesting that the understanding China and the China problem as excess savings, low consumption, industrial overcapacity, and then to a certain extent a too strong currency is all stuff that Trump experienced in the 1980s with Japan and was very kind of obsessed with tariffs already from then. For all his inconsistencies and contradictions, tariffs has been something that he has been on about since the 1980s, and also the idea of using tariffs as leverage to achieve other aims, right? So not just for protecting industries or rebalancing trade, but to achieve other and extract concessions from trading partners. But also this kind of much more immediate notion of Trump looking at the streets and going, hey, all the cars here are Mitsubishis and Toyotas, and you don't see any Chevrolets in Japan. And this is something that he's kind of repeated with regard to China as well. So it seems like an ongoing fixation, and one in which the kind of new challenger has replaced the old, almost kind of part for part, quite literally, in his imagination. And I don't know if you think that there's something meaningful to be read into that, or if that's just one of those things. We all have our hang-ups, and that's his.
You're absolutely right that this is the one, possibly apart from racism, is the one consistent part of Trump's worldview and way of thinking since the 1980s. And I think if you look also at the discourse of people who were in the Trump administration and are kind of signed up to making this project work, they're also harking back to the 1980s and to Reagan. They're comparing what they're doing explicitly to what Reagan did. They said, it was a big shock to the system. He had big setbacks in his first midterm elections, but then he went on to win 49 out of 50 states. What we're doing is going to work. And the way that they think about it is that they're facing some kind of similar challenges to what Reagan faced. So broadly speaking, it was about trade imbalances for Reagan. So the United States had started running significant trade deficits with its partners in the wake of World War II as a deliberate strategy of bolstering them against communism. So how do you get these countries up and running again? How do you get developing countries emerging from colonialism not to turn to the Soviet Union? How do you get them to develop? You open up the US market to their goods, and you understand that the terms of trade are not going to be fair and balanced. There are geopolitical reasons why you're doing it. But over time, in a system of fixed exchange rates, that made it, and especially in the context of very high military spending in the US, that created imbalances where there was a net flow of wealth out of the United States, which the US couldn't keep financing anymore. And Nixon shifted that around by coming off the gold standard and then trying to negotiate a replacement system of fixed exchange rates that also collapsed. So it was the collapse of the Bretton Woods system of managed exchange rates and the turn to more floating exchange rates that we have now. And yet the the trade deficit continued. And Japan in particular was making massive inroads, particularly in electronics, automobiles, things like this, that was started to be viewed as an existential threat to the United States. So there were books published in the 1980s called The Coming War with Japan. And this was stemming directly from Japan's mounting economic primacy and the beginnings of deindustrialization in the United States. And so what Reagan did in the 80s was very aggressive trade policy, selective tariffs on Japanese semiconductors from what he saw as distortive trade practices and the failure of Japan to stick to promises to end those distortive trade practices, and then pressing allies to devalue the dollar, so to reduce their holdings of dollars, to intervene in their currency markets so that the dollar would fall against their currencies and the United States exports would therefore be more competitive. And that was combined with a host of domestic policies, mostly deregulatory, right? The things that we understand Reagan to have done to usher in neoliberalism, attacks on organized labor, and deregulation of the economy, opening up financial markets, deregulating media, all those kinds of things. But there was also industrial policy at the same time, particularly through the Pentagon, focused on stimulating kind of high value added industries, semiconductors, for example, the defense sector, things related to energy. Now, we don't really talk about that because that doesn't really fit with our classical conception of neoliberalism, but neoliberalism in practice was always bound up from Reagan's perspective with yes, deregulation, yes, privatization, yes, attacks on organized labor, but also sotto voce industrial policy to boost American competitiveness, which was supposed to reboot American hegemony. And there is a way of understanding what both Trump in his first term and Biden in his second term were attempting to do, was to reboot US hegemony within a global trading system by violently shifting the terms of trade against their main challenger, China, and particularly, as we saw under Biden, using industrial policy domestically to also boost American competitiveness. And there are, therefore, some real parallels with the 1980s. And in the sense, the kinds of things that were motivating Reagan in terms of external deficits, right, current account deficits, trade deficits, they've got a lot worse since. The problem of the overvalued dollar relative to other currencies, that's also got worse since because more and more countries are holding more and more dollars, partly because of the instability in the global economy, the crises we saw in the 90s. Lots of countries want to hold dollar reserves to guard against future financial crises. So that problem has also worsened. So they see a series of structural problems which now have turned into domestic problems in a serious way for the United States. The hollowing out of domestic industry, which has given rise to real social distress, which the Trump administration is committed to sorting out. And now it's not just Japan, it's not just China, but all of US trading partners, including even allies, are somehow cheating, and that's the system is somehow rigged against the United States. So this is the way that they are thinking.
Yeah, and trying to mediate and measure the sort of matrix of domestic and international influences and intentions and strategies is quite a challenge. I mean, is this just Trump trying to help his? Yeah. I mean, is it like him going, well, I need to help my base, which is like small and medium sized manufacturers in the Midwest, and it's just simply just directly trying to help them or to give them something that they like, even if the long-term consequences aren't actually kind of net positive for them? Or is it trying to rearrange the whole system of world trade in line with some sort of vision? And there's a lot of options in between that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we face a challenge today of understanding how much of this is strategic, thought out, rational in and of itself from a particular point of view, and how much of this is atavistic, irrational, kind of kindergarten levels of policy making, because I think it's genuinely a mixture between those two things.
So let's go through some of the details actually before we kind of broaden out to these conceptualizations. You mentioned you referred to the Plaza Accord without mentioning it by name, which is the Accords in 1985, where they the U.S. sought to weaken the dollar relative to the currencies of its main trading partners, particularly Japan, but also France and Germany. Curiously, it's also a hotel which Trump then went and bought 3 years later and then appeared in, because that's where Home Alone 2 takes place, and Trump appears in that film. So it's all this kind of like, for all that there's serious, weighty issues going on, there's always this kind of very flighty, superficial showbiz stuff that intermeshes with it in a weird way. But anyway, there's also these Mar-a-Lago Accords, which we should talk about as well, because that would be another kind of return of the 1980s, again, trying to kind of manage currency relations.
Yes, so I think this is now kind of filtering through into mainstream commentary, but I think it's been discussed by the financial press and financial institutions for some time. The idea of a Mar-a-Lago Accord is a kind of modern day Plaza Accord, where the United States would use a threat of, or the imposition of, tariffs, and also the potential threat of the removal of the US security protection, in order to induce important partner countries to devalue the dollar. The way that they would do this, the proposed kind of plan, which is set out in a now notorious paper by Stephen Miran, when he was a senior strategist at Hudson Bay Capital, and now he's the chair of I think it's called the National Economic Council, which advises the president. And he wrote a paper in November 2024 called A User's Guide to Restructuring the Global Trading System. And this sort of sets out a particular view of the global economy, the United States' place within it. And it sets out a possible Mar-a-Lago Accord, where foreign holders of US Treasury bills, which obviously yield revenue for those foreign holders, roughly 4 to 5% at the moment, would sell those Treasury bills to the United States in exchange for 100-year bonds that don't really yield any interest at all. So the threat of tariffs and the threat of the withdrawal of the US security protection would induce these partners to do these things. The result would be that the dollar value would fall, and also that the servicing cost of US government borrowing would also fall. So it would solve two problems. One is the yawning federal deficit and the fact that debt servicing now constitutes about $1 trillion a year, which is more than the defense budget, and which increasingly people around Trump think is basically unsustainable. And it would devalue the dollar, which would make US exports more competitive and allow trade deficits to be closed. So there are some people now saying, okay, this is what's going on here, right? It might look crazy on the surface, but this Mar-a-Lago Accord is what they're aiming for. And various people have been debating this over the past couple of weeks. Some people think it's sane washing what the Trump people are doing, basically trying to see a sort of rational kernel in what they're doing, and just insisting, no, it's just chaotic, vengeful, nutcase nationalism. And other people, I think some political economists are particularly guilty of this, are sort of desperate to see the structural logic behind what's going on and to sort of see that there is a kind of underlying plan. And I think for me, both sides have only got part of the picture, because I think it's a mixture of both. I think there is the people around Trump are not stupid. And, if Trump is just some capricious monarch lashing out at foreign enemies and just doing whatever he wants, the question would be, why don't these people walk? They must
Yeah.
believe in what he's doing. They might not necessarily agree with the detail of the implementation, but they must share an understanding of what has gone wrong and an understanding of what needs to be put right and how. Otherwise, they wouldn't have agreed to join his administration, or if they've somehow been tricked into it, they would be now resigning in protest. So it's not just about caprice, even if there are elements of kindergarten levels of policy making, like getting ChatGPT to work out what your tariff rates should be. But at the same time,
It's worth dwelling on what exactly that calculus actually is, right? Because it's
yeah,
something which, in case people aren't familiar with the details, as far as I have
yes,
understood it, and maybe I'll mess this up, which will reveal my own lack of understanding, which I can then blame on Trump's confusion, not my own deficiencies, but which is that they've basically taken the percent trade deficit that the U.S. has with any given country, cut that in half. And then that figures what they've applied, which doesn't really make sense. It's kind of just
that's not
something.
quite right. So
Okay,
what
well, there
they
you go.
did was they took the US trade deficit with country X and they divided it by the value of that country's exports to the United States. And then because they're being generous, they divided that by 2. And they set a minimum floor of 10% for every territory.
Right.
Now,
That's what I said, but with extra steps. But anyway,
yes. Now, the idea was that this is a reciprocal tariff rate which is meant to match the trade barriers put up by others, right? This is what Trump said he wanted. He would impose reciprocal tariffs. And Peter Navarro, his senior counselor for manufacturing, has come out and in the Financial Times and just defended this and said, this is fair. The system is rigged against the United States. Trade partners are cheating on their obligations. This is just restoring a fair terms of trade. Now, obviously, if you work out the formula like this, it's just the US trade deficit divided by the quantity of exports, and everybody pays 10%, even if you have no trade deficit. So there's no way that is any kind of calculation of the actual barriers to US exports into country X. It's just a completely arbitrary way of working out what that is, partly because it's virtually impossible to quantify all the formal tariff and non-tariff barriers to trade and work out what the tariff would be, because it would be extremely difficult to do that for every kind of good in the world. So it is almost certain that instead somebody in the administration asked an AI chatbot how they could do this, and then they did it, because 4 out of 4 of the leading chatbots tell you that this is how you should do it. This is how you could work out what a reciprocal tariff should look like. And so they went with that.
well,
And
the big tension, of course, in the White House must be whether they used Grok or a competitor's AI, because that could be the source of a real
we
falling
might come
out.
back to this because Musk is actually opposed to the tariffs. So we might come back to that later on.
Well, and has proposed a sort of free trade zone with Europe. So that's all quite curious. But
Yeah, it's not totally inconsistent with some elements of other Trump administration thinking as well, which we might come back to later. But just to finish the thought on chatbots, the other reason to think that chatbots were used is that the list of tariffed territories included uninhabited islands, only populated by seals and penguins, and the US military base at Diego Garcia. So it's almost as if the territory list was somehow also devised by a chatbot rather than
they just downloaded the list of all countries and territories, not considering whether they're like actual sovereign territories.
Indeed.
But, and in any case, guano
they
exports
have no
are way
trade with
down
the
now.
United States.
Yeah.
Yeah, indeed. So there are clearly, kindergarten levels of policy making within the administration, right? If you go to the paper that I mentioned, the Miran paper, it does not suggest anything like this, right? It suggests a much more cautious approach. It suggests broadly a multilateral approach, or if you're going to go for a unilateral approach, to do it very gradually, ratchet up over time. hold to a tariff rate around about a maximum of 10%, except for a few enemy countries that don't play ball. That's the approach that Iran is suggesting.
Right,
And
and
that's
certain
not what's
goods
happened.
presumably as well, more targeted at
Yes,
that level.
because Iran is very clear that low value added, labor intensive industries are not going to reshore to the United States. He's very clear about that.
Hence the memes about MAGA supporters sewing socks in the U.S.,
Right.
which is
And
the type of good which the U.S. isn't going to produce.
Right. So if Miran's paper is basically now US policy, then you would expect a much more calibrated set of tariffs, right? Firstly, you start low and you ratchet up and you try to do it as much as possible in a kind of multilateral setting, and you reserve your highest tariff for enemy states that are not going to play ball with you.
Certainly,
And also, you probably focus your tariffs on industries where you think you've got some chance of reshoring, so the higher value added stuff. But you wouldn't. But what's actually happened in practice is the United States has slapped some of its closest allies and partners, particularly in East Asia, with extremely high tariff rates. But it's also slapped extremely high tariff rates on some of the world's poorest countries, which export things like socks, as you say, to the United States.
yeah,
And so that suggests that
mentioned in many cases, which is, I mean, I assume it's some
Bangladesh.
mining, but yeah.
Bangladesh is going to get absolutely hammered by US tariffs. Sri Lanka, the same. There's no mediation here at all around, what's the value of these products? Is there a chance of reshoring? Geostrategically, do we need to let some countries off? Do we want to apply more pressure? It's just, chat GPT, tell me how to do reciprocal tariffs, and we just did it. And so although there is an underlying worldview which you can account for around these global deficits and the fact that the US cannot keep bearing the burden of being the global reserve currency, of having constant outflow of wealth through massive trade deficits, cannot keep going on with deindustrialization. These are all parts of the Trumpian analysis of what's going on. And these things are rational and reasonable understandings of what is happening under globalization to the American economy. There are other aspects of the diagnosis that are either very partial, highly ideological, whatever. But that's the sort of rational kernel. And then the policy response, even if it was well designed, I think is full of contradictions, which again we could get onto. But the actual policy response doesn't correspond to these technocratic, wonkish papers that some of my political economist colleagues are saying, oh, that's what's really going on here. It is a mixture between the sort of the rational assessment of what's going on, their ideological worldview, and the sort of chaotic nature of the Trump administration and its policy making, and its ideological nature as well. And I think the fact that this is a moment of considerable chaos, decay, disruption. So that's the way that I would try to think about these things, is let's get inside these people's heads, understand what they think the world is like, what they think they are doing, and then there's a question of what they are actually doing. And it doesn't seem to me that the wonks who are designing MAGA policy are necessarily the ones in the driving seat.
So on that point, I mean, I want to come to kind of gaming out what some of these possibilities actually are, but Adam Tooze noted, I think this week, that it was Trump making the calls on the tariff levels himself, which you might say, well, okay, he's the executive, but generally these are kind of quite technical things which rely on a lot of knowledge, as you've already kind of been saying, Lee, about what the U.S. produces, what it can't produce, what the effects of tariff will be on which goods, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, which is the thing called the scientific kind of tariff, which was developed, I think, probably late 19th century, early 20th century. And that Trump making the calls on the tariffs by himself or with the aid of ChatGPT, to not offend his friend Musk, Grok, he making them to himself is like a kind of return to 19th century or earlier statecraft of a kind of monarch getting involved in detailed policy or in military tactics out of just caprice, basically. And I mean, I don't know if that's true, and obviously it comes off as a defense of technocracy rather than kind of the kind of executive decision making. But I think in this case, you can say, well, I don't think to accept that portrayal of or that sort of those options of either technocracy or of sort of the individual's decision making of Trump is to buy into, I think, too much populist, self-serving populist understanding of the way these things are. That either you have the technocrats and the wonks making the decisions against, behind the backs of the people, or you have just an elected monarch basically making decisions on a whim to please one constituency or another. And I think those are not the only. That's not the full universe of options.
No, I'm not familiar with the article or the post that of Tooze's that you're referring to, but it seems to me to think of this as a capricious act by a single individual is to miss the point that I'm making earlier on, which is that this is an administration. Trump has found it considerably easier to staff up his administration this time round with people who are broadly like-minded, right? These people may have been a bit sideswiped by the level of the tariffs. Perhaps they were. There's some suggestion that Scott Bessent was quite surprised by them, but then and some rumours that he's looking for a way out, maybe. But if you look at other things that Scott Bessent, the Secretary of Treasury, has said, they're very aligned with the Trumpian worldview. Go and have a look at his interview with Tucker Carlson, and the worldview is laid out very clearly. And the idea that this is going to be a solution to the problems is also laid out. And the fact that this is going to be about redistribution, there's going to be short-term pain, it's all there. So I think a focus on one individual doesn't do enough justice to the idea that it's a movement. It's out there in society. It's been out there for quite some time, since the Tea Party onwards. It has found political expression in a transformed Republican Party, which has moved towards a radical right position on the world economy and on world order more generally, which is much more in line with Trump's outlook. And there are now policy elites who've sort of been generated out there in think tanks and business groups and so on for some time, who share a broad assessment of the challenges and a broad assessment of how to go about them. So there may be disagreements over specifics, but there does seem to be broad agreement among his economic policymakers.
Yeah, indeed. As much as the administration as a whole reflects a heterogeneous coalition, perhaps on trade, especially because, as we said at the top, trade and tariffs have been so close to Trump's heart right from the start. You'd expect that there would be some, unity of thought on this matter, if not on, policy across the board. Now, I wanted to kind of move on to kind of working through some of these scenarios, though I'm going to take the opportunity just briefly to clarify what I was saying earlier. That quote attributed to Lenin, in which there are decades where nothing happens and there's weeks where decades happen, interestingly, was first attributed to Lenin by George Galloway in 2001, which might be a kind of misunderstanding or a reformulation of a bit where Lenin says, in the space of a few months, we passed through a number of stages of collaboration with the bourgeoisie and of shaking off petty bourgeois illusions for which other countries have required decades. But there are quotes from other people which are closer to the one which is regularly misattributed to Lenin. One from the Mexican poet Homero Arigis, who says there are centuries in which nothing happens and years in which centuries pass. So anyway, I assume through some complicated course, some of maybe Lenin's general insight made it into a Mexican poem, and then somehow to George Galloway, and then attributed to Lenin thenceforth. So now as we and if we repeat that line at some point and attribute it to Lenin, we can correct ourselves because we have this on record.
It's interesting that harking back to the past, to try to get a handle on the future is both what's happening with the kind of Lenin quote, is that to kind of understand what's going on, we reach back for quotations in the past. Twos is reaching back to monarchical rule in the 19th century. Others are harkening back to the 1980s. And I think this is just it's a bit of a digression, but we do this as human beings, right? In order to try and make sense of particularly in confusing times in the present, we tend to engage in analogous thinking, right? We look back to the past. And the most famous analogy in the past has been the Munich analogy. You can't bargain with an enemy. You can't appease an enemy because it only emboldens them. And we can think about various ways in which that has been crucial to justifying US wars in Korea, in Vietnam, the war in Ukraine, most recently, etc. And so it's very powerful. And it reminds us of the Marx line about the past weighing like a nightmare on the brains of the living. Sometimes historical analogies can be useful, but what they always lack is a reckoning with the historical specificities of the present moment. This reminds me also of the conversation you had recently with Todd McGowan about learning from history. History doesn't repeat itself, so we shouldn't be too wedded. The current moment, in the way that people in the administration might be harking back to the 1980s, it doesn't reckon with the way that the global economy has evolved since the 1980s.
It might help us understand their thinking, but it doesn't help us understand the world. Well,
Yes.
and as we've said on this podcast a number of times, maybe history does kind of not repeat itself, resemble certain patterns of the past, but we live in particularly unique times, I think, in terms of it being very much modern world, but without an internal opposition to capitalism, and so on and so forth. We don't need to repeat the whole argument now, but I think it reconfigures things in such a profound way that we can't draw from the 1980s, from the 1960s, from the 1840s for that matter either. And everyone has their preferred one. I even toyed with the idea of perhaps doing one of these episodes that we've done where we invite lots of guests on to present different pitches for like, what is the best historical analogy for today? But the conclusion would be, no, you're all wrong. So I don't think it works as a competition where it's like, who wins the big prize? No one. You all failed. So maybe we won't do that. Though if listeners are really keen on hearing that, do get in touch. Anyway. What do they think they're doing? What is it that they think they're doing, the Trump administration? So I've noted down some possibilities here. This is by no means captures the full universe of possibility. But so firstly, is it straightforwardly the tariffs? Is it straightforwardly about supporting domestic manufacturers? Hello, friends. You've reached the end of a sample from an episode only available to subscribers. We put out 2 episodes a month for free. For access to the rest in its entirety, please join us at patreon.com/bungacast. For $7 a month, subscribers receive original, exclusive episodes with the entirety of the BungaCast cast. That's George Hoare, myself, Alex Hochuli, and our contributing editors, Philip Cunliffe, Amber Lee Frost, Catherine Liu, Lee Jones, Alex Gurevich, and Lee Phillips. We've got extended interviews with guests, episodes on current affairs, and original episodes on theory, history, and culture, so as to understand the crises of our times. We also have the BungaCast Reading Club, where Phil, George, and myself present the key books and essays necessary for understanding the world today, how we got here, and where we might be going. Subscribers also get a digital subscription to Damage Magazine, with whom we're partnered, and you can find all this info at patreon.com/bungacast. We do hope you'll join us. These are turbulent times, and ideologically confused ones as well. What we try to do is find political clarity, to move beyond the decadent age of Bunga Bunga.
Buenos Aires.